Malta and Gozo, and welcome to another edition of Lovin Daily. I'm your host, Jonathan Chilia, joined by my co-host, JP Atsopardi, and here are your headlines for today. HAMRUN turns into a street party after Spartans secure inspiring win over Valletta FC. Motorists cry foul after allegedly being stopped for being too loud. GOZITAN priests accused of rape denied bail. New COVID-19 restrictions impose curfew on restaurants. And PN files complaint against TVM journalist over questions in Bernard GRECH interview. Quite a mix of stories we have here this morning. JP, do you want to just jump into the first one?
Absolutely. So the biggest story coming from yesterday wasn't the fact that HAMRUN beat Valletta FC 3-0 in an inspiring win to keep the lead in the league, but the fact that HAMRUN Spartan fans took to the street in celebration last night, defying COVID-19 rules and new fresh restrictions imposed by Prime Minister Robert Abela earlier that day. Video footage circulated online and on social media shows a bunch of HAMRUN Spartan fans embracing last night's inspiring win, taking to the streets, chanting. There was a carcade, people were honking, and in fact in the background you can see some smoke and some flares. Obviously they were having a great time, but it's not perhaps the best time to be celebrating given the fact that we're still in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic. And yesterday afternoon, Robert Abela announced new measures which we'll be discussing later on in the show. But essentially the celebrations, while somewhat understandable given their historic win and the historic season that HAMRUN Spartans have had, has been condemned by many people online, anyone who isn't a HAMRUN Spartans fan, basically, for what has been considered quite irresponsible behavior as Malta continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic.
I mean, it was only just a few months ago that we were, shocked at the images of Floriana FC supporters at the Fossos in Floriana celebrating en masse. And let's be clear, there were many, many more people during the Floriana celebration than during the HAMRUN Spartan celebration last night. Listen, I get it, HAMRUNs have been trying for years to get to the top of the league. They must be literally euphoric. The fans must be over the moon. However, it's been weeks of rising cases. The numbers are not really going down. So a bit of sense might have really, made sense last night. It does seem like that once police did show up, the crowd did disperse and they did cooperate with police. It doesn't seem like there were any fights or arrests or anything of the sort. So definitely stay tuned to lovinmalta.com today, because we will be following up the story and speaking to all the relevant people in this case. Moving on to the next story. This was a bit of a big story yesterday. I didn't know how many people this affected. Maltese motorists, that's car enthusiasts as well as motorcycle enthusiasts, have cried foul after last Sunday, apparently many drivers were stopped along the coast road for their vehicles being too loud. So a number of people took to social media to say they feel aggrieved that, there's such a large community of car enthusiasts in Malta. They've been practicing it, this hobby of theirs for over 20 years. They've been promised a dedicated track for over 20 years, and they have yet to be given that. Because they don't have an area to practice their sport, they're forced to take to the roads, such as Coast Road, to show off their nice loud cars. But apparently they were stopped by Transport Malta officials because their cars were so loud. One guy spoke about how he was sent to the back of a long queue for over an hour while he waited for an inspection of his vehicle. This led to other motorists, crying out, jumping in and saying, listen, we experienced this as well. It really seems like they're really hurt by this. Now, the thing is this. A loud car can be really annoying. I'm going to be very honest. I live in quite a narrow street. Every time a very loud car passes through my street, my whole house rattles. So maybe having a dedicated space for them to, drive around and rev and stuff might be good. But at the same time, I don't know, if they are being stopped and being, discriminated against for their loud vehicles, that might not be on as well.
No, I agree. They absolutely should have a space where they can practice their hobby. I totally agree with that, and a safe space as well. Driving on the coast road and at quite fast speeds is a danger, and we all know that, given that in the past there have been numerous occasions where people have died as a result of accidents. If you go on a Sunday on a crossroad, Sunday at the Coast Road, sorry, you will see all these motorists and car enthusiasts out there, and it can be quite dangerous. So I do understand where they're coming from. Obviously, if they've been promised a track, they wholly deserve one. There's a big community in here and a healthy community. At the same time, Transport Malta are doing their job in this sense, and I think there has to be more enforcement for the fact that I don't want to see any more people die as a result of this. So. We'll just have to see where it goes, but hopefully they do get their track. Moving on to our third story of the day, GOZITAN priests have been accused of rape were denied bail. So one of the biggest stories to come out this week, one of the most shocking stories. Joseph Cini and Joseph Sultana, both Cini in his 70s and Sultana, an 84-year-old priest, who are both quite well known in their own parishes in Gozo, were accused of raping and corrupting a minor, a boy who at the time was 8 years old. He's now since grown up and has spoken out about his horrific experience being abused by these two priests. He went yesterday in a testimony via video conference. He went into disturbing details that showed that he was visibly and emotionally distraught by the experience of being apparently raped by these two priests. The priests were seen yesterday leaving court, and it's been revealed since that they've been denied bail and being held in custody until this pans out. But absolutely shocking story, to hear coming from people who in the community are meant to be so well respected, someone that you can find in and trust, and obviously it's a shock for Gozo.
No, obviously this is a case that was major news yesterday. Everyone in Malta and Gozo were talking about it. Now it's important to remember that the court case is still ongoing, and we should abide by the idea, innocent until proven guilty, absolutely. For sure. However, the testimony is shocking. The victim spoke about how the first time it happened, it was on a Sunday, and that the confession box was involved as well. The details are really, really, they really drive home, and you can really actually picture it, unfortunately. What was interesting to note is that after the court case, as the priests were leaving, journalists were on scene to ask them, "Are you sorry over what you've done? Are you sorry over what you've done?" And one of the priests, Cini, waved his handkerchief and said, "Don't you see me crying?" Which caused a massive backlash. Some people were thinking that he meant it sarcastically. Some people thought he meant it genuinely. Some people said that he was crying. Some people said that he was just taking the piss. So. It's very, very emotional, and to see this happening in the sister island of Gozo is just even more shocking. So there will definitely be developments on this story over the next few days and weeks, so stay tuned for that. Moving on to the next major story that happened yesterday. Prime Minister Robert Abela, flanked by Deputy Prime Minister Chris Fearn and Superintendent of Public Health Sharmi Gauci, announced a swath of new regulations as we're trying to stave off this COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously Carnival, major festival right around the corner. Mass events during Carnival will not be happening in Malta and Gozo, which is shocking to see. If you remember, last year Carnival did happen. I mean, I was in Nador myself, and many people were dressed as the coronavirus, taking it as a joke. So it's shocking to think that the 1 year on, just how serious it actually developed into. Aside from that, anyone who's boarding the Gozo ferry between the 11th and the 17th of February will have to have their temperatures checked, and they're being advised to stay inside their car while on the Gozo ferry. Aside from this, during Carnival weekend, there will be special police rounds going through certain hotspots such as Nador, Rabat, Marsalforn, Shlendi, to ensure there's no mass gatherings. And they'll also be going to certain accommodations as part of inspections to make sure that there are not more people in the accommodation than there are beds. So quite a swath of new measures. JP, what do you make of them?
So, I mean, obviously these new measures have been implemented in order to kind of address the Carnival and the potential spread of the virus as a result of that weekend. But obviously it seems like to extend, in some cases, might go beyond the Carnival weekend. I mean, we see the extension of bars and casini being closed, so at least end of February, but with no real indication of when they'll open up. So, in some cases, it's, I mean, obviously some restrictions are needed to address the Carnival weekend, but I feel that these bars and casini are being really, really disadvantaged greatly in this whole pandemic. It's been since October now that they've been closed. People's livelihoods are at stake, and in the meantime, restaurants and other places where you can drink alcohol have been allowed to open. Obviously, there's new restrictions on restaurants now, so they now are being more impacted by this. And for me, it's a matter of how is the government going to compensate these thousands of people who's unlike me and you, haven't had work for months and are going to face the biggest uphill battle ever once they are allowed to open to survive. So I agree with restrictions, but I also feel that we need to be more uniform in how we apply them, and we need to really consider the fact that there's a huge economic repercussions of this pandemic, and we should take it much more seriously. Moving on to our final story of today, the PN has filed complaints against TVM journalists over questions in a Bernard Grech interview last week. So Bernard Grech had featured on TVM journalist Glenn Falzon's show Insight, where he had adopted a confrontational stance, repeatedly accusing the journalist for following the PL, the Labour's political narrative, in his choice of questions to the opposition leader. In a complaint to PBS and the Broadcasting Authority, PN Secretary General Francis Zamit Demek claimed that Falzon's questions and behaviour were clearly inspired and based on the Labour Party's partisan narrative against Grech and the PN, and obviously since then they've escalated a bit further and have filed a formal complaint against Falzon. Questions that really irked Grech were amongst his recent cabinet reshuffle and shadow cabinet, an opinion piece by the Times of Malta columnist Christina Ketkuti, and his plans for Air Malta. Basically, these questions, or at least some of these questions, the Air Malta one, for example, were also asked to Prime Minister Robert Abela. What PN are saying is the way these questions were asked and the way they were posed by Falzon were different for Abela as they were for Grech, and they intended to get a different reaction out of Grech and keep prodding him on issues that he said, that they claim he had answered on already. Obviously, being journalists ourselves, we know the difficulty we might face, and the fact that we might have to ask hard questions to politicians, especially politicians in Malta. But PN seems to be taking it a step further and now find a formal complaint. So we'll see what has to go.
I think this is a very interesting story, actually. It's walking a fine line between, impartiality in the national broadcaster TVM, which by the constitution, by law, we should be having, as well as, a politician not able to handle some questions.
Yeah.
So let's be clear, Bernard Grech is still relatively new to the political game. I remember when Robert Abela started, he really wasn't that good at fielding questions either. He'd be blabbing about and going left and going right. He's still not perfect, but he's really developed. And I do hope to see the same in Bernard Grech. I know recently we had a Vox Pop with Bernard Grech where we asked him about euthanasia, and his response was really not appropriate. So I'm not sure if, there needs to be a bit of development both in how he fields questions and how he keeps us calm when asked tough questions. Because let's be clear, if you want to be the leader of a political party, if you want to be the prime minister of a nation, you're going to be getting some tough questions every single day. So you really have to know how to handle that.
Absolutely.
That said, in their complaint, they did note some discrepancies between the questions asked to the Prime Minister, Robert Abela, and to Bernard Grech. And, they said, quote, that the Prime Minister was treated with kids' gloves, while the opposition leader was treated with an iron fist. So obviously they see things as quite, quite different in the approaches to the two political leaders. We'll see how this complaint is treated by authorities in question. But I think it's really interesting to see these kind of complaints happening as Malta is discussing, party media, the importance of party media, and whether they breach the constitution. I think that brings us to the end of today's episode. Both from myself and JP, have a day full of lovin'.